One breath for two, where magic is a curse and blood is the price of redemption. When ancient sins char the soul, the only salvation is the one you swore to hate forever. We are about to listen to this story right now. The rain lashed against the enchanted windows of the Ministry of Magic, a relentless, rhythmical drumming that usually soothed Hermione Granger. Tonight, however, it sounded like a warning. The atrium was empty, a cavern of polished obsidian reflecting the flicker of dying torches. But Hermione's heels clicked with a sharp staccato urgency as she made her way toward the lifts. It had been 3 years. 3 years of rebuilding, of burying the dead, of plastering over the cracks in the castle walls and the gaping holes in their own souls. Hermione had buried herself in the Department of Mysteries, finding a strange comfort in the unspeakable's code of silence. Here, among prophecies and time-turners, she didn't have to be the Golden Girl. She didn't have to explain why her relationship with Ron had dissolved into a polite, suffocating friendship, or why she woke up at 3 a.m. reaching for a wand that was already in her hand. The golden grills of the lift rattled open. "Level 9, the cool female voice announced. "Department of Mysteries." The air down here was different. It tasted of ozone and ancient dust, of magic that had curdled and gone stale. Kingsley's owl had been brief, the parchment heavy with the minister's seal. Code black. Secure holding room 4. You are the only one with the clearance and the arithmancy background required. She hadn't asked who the prisoner was. She hadn't asked why it couldn't wait until morning. Hermione pushed open the heavy oak door to holding room 4. The room was circular, lit only by a singular, hovering orb of pale light that cast long, distorted shadows against the stone walls. It was freezing, a supernatural cold that bit through her robes and settled into the marrow of her bones. And there, sitting on a simple wooden chair in the center of the room, was Draco Malfoy. He didn't look up when she entered. He was staring at his hands, which were resting on his knees. The first thing that struck her was the silence. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, suffocating, a physical weight pressing against her chest. "Malfoy," she said. Her voice sounded too loud, too brisk in the stillness. He moved then, slowly, as if the air around him had turned to treacle. He lifted his head, and Hermione felt a jolt of shock that she masked instantly with a tightening of her jaw. He looked ruinous. The arrogance was still there, etched into the sharp line of his jaw and the arch of his brow, but it was brittle now, like glass on the verge of shattering. His skin was translucent, the color of old parchment, making the dark circles under his eyes look like bruises. He was wearing a black shirt, the top buttons undone, and he looked thinner than she remembered, sharper, as if the softness of youth had been carved away by a dull knife. "Granger," he drawled. The voice was the same, that distinct aristocratic cadence, but it lacked the heat of their school days. It was dry, raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "I should have known. Shacklebolt has a twisted sense of humor." "It's not humor, Malfoy. It's protocol," she said, walking further into the room. She placed her leather satchel on the table, keeping her movements precise. She needed the barrier of professionalism. She needed to be the unspeakable, not the Gryffindor who remembered the sound of his voice calling her a mudblood. "I'm told there is an artifact. A cursed object you refuse to surrender to the DMLE. Draco let out a short, humorless laugh. He leaned back in the chair, but the movement looked painful. He winced, a micro-expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared, but Hermione caught it. An object, he repeated, looking at the ceiling. Is that what they told you? Stop playing games. I'm here to catalogue it, contain it, and process you. She pulled a quill and parchment from her bag. Where is it? You're looking at it. Hermione paused, her quill hovering over the paper. She looked around the empty room, then back at him. I don't have time for riddles. Where is the dark artifact? I am the artifact, Granger. He lowered his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time, she really looked into his eyes. They were grey, but not the storm cloud grey she remembered. They were dull, flat, like a winter sky before a blizzard. And deep within them, she saw something that terrified her more than his sneer ever had. Resignation. A blood curse, she whispered, the realization dawning on her with the cold logic of an arithmancer. The Malfoy line. I read the rumours. Rumours are usually boring. The truth is much more visceral. He began to roll up the sleeve of his left arm. Hermione braced herself to see the dark mark. She expected the faded skull and snake, the ugly brand of his past mistakes. But when he exposed his forearm, the air left her lungs in a sharp hiss. The dark mark was there, but it was being consumed. Veins of inky blackness radiated from the mark, crawling up his arm like a living infection. The skin around them was angry and red, blistering as if burned from the inside out. But it wasn't just physical. She could feel the magic emanating from the wound. It felt like hatred, like ancient, concentrated malice. It was a parasitic magic, feeding on his core. It woke up 3 months ago, Draco said quietly, watching her face with a detached curiosity. My father's death triggered the inheritance, but the blood is tainted. The magic rejects the carrier. It's burning through my magical core to sustain itself. You're dying, Hermione stated. It wasn't a question. Slowly, painfully, and with a spectacular lack of dignity. He rolled his sleeve down, hiding the horror. I turned myself in because the manor is no longer safe. The ambient magic there feeds it. I thought a ministry cell might dampen the progression. And has it? No. Hermione took a step closer, her professional detachment wavering. She was a healer of broken things. It was her nature. She saw a puzzle, a problem, and her mind immediately raced for a solution. But beneath that, she felt a strange, jarring pang of pity. He was 21 years old. He was a war criminal, yes, but he was also a boy who had made impossible choices. Why me? She asked softly. Why did Kingsley send me? Draco closed his eyes, his head tipping back against the chair. The line of his throat was pale and vulnerable. Because you're the only one clever enough to figure out how to stop it from exploding when I finally kick the bucket, Granger. And you're the only one who won't care when I do. The words were meant to sting, to push her away, but they landed with a dull thud. He truly believed that. He believed his life was forfeit, and that she would spectate his death with indifference. I am an unspeakable, she said, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed anger. My job is to analyze magic, not to conduct funeral rites for pureblood bigots. She stepped into his personal space, raising her wand. Diagnostic. The spell washed over him in a wave of golden light. Draco flinched violently, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so hard his knuckles turned white. "Don't!" he hissed through gritted teeth. "Hold still, Malfoy." "I said, don't." He surged upward, knocking her wand hand aside. For a split second, his hand wrapped around her wrist. The contact was electric. It wasn't a spark. It was a shockwave. Hermione gasped, freezing in place. His skin was ice cold, but where he touched her, it felt like a brand. A rush of images flooded her mind, unbidden and chaotic. A dark room, the smell of rain, a screaming silence, the feeling of drowning in cold water. Draco snatched his hand back as if she burned him. He stumbled back, colliding with the stone wall, his chest heaving. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown, the mask of indifference completely shattered. "What was that?" Hermione whispered, clutching her wrist. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Draco stared at her, horror dawning on his face. He looked at his hand, then at her. He looked terrified, not of dying, but of her. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice raw. "You have to leave. Now. Tell Shacklebolt I refuse the analysis." "We both felt that, Malfoy. That wasn't just the curse." "It's a side effect," he shouted, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "The magic is unstable. It will lash out at anything nearby, especially something incompatible." Incompatible. The word hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their history. Mudblood and pureblood, victor and vanquished. Hermione straightened her spine. The fear was still there, fluttering in her stomach, but her resolve hardened. She had never walked away from a fight, and she had never walked away from a mystery. "I am not leaving," she said, her voice steady. "I have orders. And frankly, Malfoy, you look like you're about to collapse. If this magic is as volatile as the diagnostic suggests, you are a walking bomb in the middle of London. I am not going to let you blow up the ministry just because you're too proud to let a Muggle-born help you." Draco slumped against the wall, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had come. He slid down until he was sitting on the floor, one leg drawn up, his arm resting on his knee. He looked small. "It's not pride, Granger," he whispered, looking at the floor. The shadows seemed to curl around him, embracing him like a dark lover. "It's containment. You don't understand what this is." "Then teach me," she challenged. She walked over and sat on the chair he had vacated, looking down at him. "Tell me what I'm looking at." He stayed silent for a long time. The only sound was the rain outside and the ragged rhythm of his breathing. Finally, he looked up. The hostility was gone, replaced by a weary desperation. "The Malfoy blood demands purity," he said, his voice hollow. "It demands payment for the sins of the past. My father didn't pay. My grandfather didn't pay. The debt has fallen to me." "And what is the payment?" Draco's eyes locked onto hers. The intensity of his gaze pinned her in place. "It requires a bond, an anchor, someone to share the weight of the magic before it crushes the host." He let out a dark, broken laugh. "But the irony is, it requires a bond of absolute trust. And I have no one." Hermione looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the boy who had been given an impossible task by Voldemort. She saw the young man who had lowered his wand on the astronomy tower. She saw a person who had been drowning for years while the world cheered for his punishment. She felt the seesaw tip. The repulsion of his prejudice was outweighed by the gravity of his loneliness. "You have me," she said. The words were out before she could check them. Draco stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face hardened. The wall went back up. "I'd rather die," he spat, venom dripping from every syllable. "I'd rather rot in this cell than be indebted to you." "Good," Hermione snapped, standing up and smoothing her skirt. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, professional steel. "Because I'm not offering you friendship, Malfoy. I'm offering you a procedure. You're my assignment, and I never fail an assignment." She turned her back on him to arrange her instruments, missing the way his eyes lingered on her silhouette. She missed the way his hand twitched, reaching out toward her before curling into a tight, trembling fist. Outside, thunder rolled, shaking the foundations of the ministry. Inside, the air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm. "Get your wand ready, Granger," Draco whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible. "Because this is going to hurt." The damp cold of the ministry's lower levels seemed to seep into Hermione's very thoughts as the days bled into a singular grey continuum. Holding room 4 had become her universe. She had moved a desk into the corner, cluttered with ancient arithmancy charts, lunar calendars, and thick, leather-bound volumes on blood magic that smelled of sulphur and iron. Draco Malfoy remained a ghost in the centre of it all. He spoke little, his presence reduced to the sound of his shallow breathing and the occasional sharp hiss of pain when the black veins on his arm pulsed with a life of their own. "You're staring, Granger," Draco said, his eyes closed, head resting against the cold stone wall. "It's rude, even for a Gryffindor." Hermione didn't look away from the parchment where she was calculating the decay rate of the curse's magical signature. "I'm observing. There's a difference. The difference is that one involves clinical interest and the other involves morbid fascination with a corpse-to-be." He opened his eyes, and the silver depths were clouded with a fresh wave of agony. He gripped his left forearm, his knuckles turning a ghostly white. Hermione dropped her quill. The professional mask she had carefully constructed over the last 48 hours cracked. She stood up and crossed the small space between them. The air grew colder the closer she got to him, a localized winter that heralded the curse's hunger. "Let me see it," she commanded. "No. Malfoy, don't be a martyr. It doesn't suit you." She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the silk of his sleeve. He looked up at her, a flash of the old Malfoy fire igniting in his gaze. Defiant, aristocratic, and desperately lonely. "If you touch me while the magic is surging, it will burn you too. It's looking for a bridge, Hermione. It wants to jump." Her name on his tongue felt like a physical weight. It wasn't a taunt anymore. It was an acknowledgement. She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. The logic of the unspeakable told her to retreat, to maintain the distance required for safety. But the girl who had stayed in a tent for a year, hunting Horcruxes, couldn't ignore the raw sufferings in front of her. "I'm grounded," she whispered, more to herself than him. "I've cast a dozen containment charms on my own skin." "Charms won't stop a blood debt," he rasped. Despite his warning, she sank to her knees on the cold floor in front of him. Gently, with a hand that trembled only slightly, she reached for his wrist. As her fingers brushed his skin, the room seemed to tilt. The darkness beneath his skin didn't just look like ink. It felt like a vibration, a low-frequency hum that resonated in her own teeth. Draco let out a broken groan, his eyes fluttering shut as her warmth collided with his unnatural chill. "It's moving," she murmured, her eyes wide as she watched a black vein creep toward his elbow. The arithmancy was wrong. It's not linear. It's sentient. "It's a Malfoy," Draco choked out, a ghost of a smirk playing on his bloodless lips. "Of course it's difficult." Hermione didn't laugh. She adjusted her grip, her thumb pressing into the pulse point of his wrist. She felt his heart, fast, erratic, terrified. For a moment, the barrier between them thinned until it was non-existent. She wasn't just touching a patient. She was touching the boy who had watched her being tortured on his drawing room floor. She was touching the man who had carried the weight of a dying dynasty on his narrow shoulders. The tension in the room shifted. It was no longer just about the curse. It was about the way Draco's breath hitched when her thumb stroked the soft skin of his inner arm. It was about the way Hermione leaned in, her hair falling forward to veil them in a private, chestnut-coloured world. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice a mere sliver of sound. "I called you. Things I can't take back. I stood by while they hurt you. I am the reason you have that scar on your arm." Hermione froze. She felt the phantom itch of the word mudblood carved into her flesh, hidden beneath her robes. She looked at him, and for a second she wanted to pull away. She wanted to let the cold consume him. The memory of the manor was a jagged shard in her chest. "I know what you are, Draco," she said, her voice hard, "and I know what you did. But I also know that if I let you die here, I'm letting that version of the world win. I'm letting the hate have the final word." She looked down at his arm, the black rot of his heritage. This curse, it's fed by the idea that some blood is better than others. It's the ultimate pureblood irony, isn't it? Your own magic is killing you because it thinks you're not pure enough in your loyalty to its darkness. Draco flinched as if she'd slapped him. "I never wanted it. Not really." "I know." The silence that followed was different. It was heavy, but not suffocating. It was a shared burden. Hermione began to hum a low rhythmic incantation, an ancient Celtic stabilization spell. As she sang the wordless tune, she felt the curse recoil. The black veins slowed their frantic crawl. Draco's head fell forward, his forehead coming to rest against her shoulder. It was a moment of total vulnerability. He wasn't the Ice Prince of Slytherin. He was a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood in a storm. Hermione's breath caught. She should move. She should maintain the boundary. But she found herself shifting closer, her free hand coming up to hover near his hair before she caught herself and dropped it. The scent of him, expensive cologne, old parchment, and the metallic tang of dark magic filled her senses. "Stay," he whispered against her robes. "Please, just for a moment. The noise, it stops when you touch me." The noise. She understood then. The curse wasn't just physical. It was a mental siege, a constant screaming of his ancestors' expectations. "I'm here," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she didn't want to name. They stayed like that for a long time, two enemies huddled on a damp floor in the bowels of a government building. The seesaw had swung toward a fragile, dangerous warmth. But Hermione knew the mechanics of magic better than anyone. Balance was a requirement. For every inch of warmth they found, the cold would demand its due. Suddenly, Draco stiffened. He wrenched himself away from her, his face contorting in a mask of sudden, sharp loathing. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice cracking. Hermione blinked, stunned by the sudden reversal. "What? Malfoy, the spell was working." "It's a lie." He scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm, his eyes wild and accusing. "You're doing something to me. This softness. It's a trick. You want me to beg, don't you? You want the great Draco Malfoy to crawl at your feet so you can finally feel superior." "How can you even think that?" she cried, standing up, her heart stinging from the sudden coldness in his tone. "I was trying to help you." "I don't want your pity, Granger, and I don't want your touch. It's revolting." He turned his back on her, his shoulders shaking. "You're a researcher. Do your job. Find the ritual and stay on your side of the room." The insult hit her like a physical blow. The revolting comment stung more than it should have, stripping away the brief moment of connection and replacing it with the old familiar bile of their school years. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "Die in your corner, Malfoy. I'll be at my desk, cataloguing your demise." She retreated to her corner, slamming a heavy book onto the desk. The silence returned, but this time it was jagged, filled with the sharp edges of broken trust. She stared at the pages, but the runes blurred. All she could feel was the lingering chill on her fingers where his skin had been, and the echo of his heartbeat. He was pushing her away because he was afraid. She knew that. But as she watched him from the corner of her eye, hunched over and shivering in the dim light, she realized the true danger. The curse wasn't just killing him. It was feeding on the very possibility of them becoming something else. And as the ink on his arm began to pulse with renewed vigor, Hermione realized that the sins of pure blood were not easily washed away by a few kind words and a diagnostic spell. The cliffhanger was no longer whether he would survive the night, but whether she would even want him to. She reached for a new piece of parchment, her hand shaking. There was one ritual she hadn't investigated yet, a ritual of equivalence. It required the blood of the cursed and the blood of the incompatible. It was a death sentence for a pureblood, or a rebirth. "Malfoy," she said, her voice cold and flat. "What?" he barked without turning around. "I found the ritual, but you're going to hate the price." He finally turned, his face a pale mask of exhaustion. "Tell me." "It requires a sacrifice of pride," she said, her eyes locking onto his, "and a physical union of magic that cannot be undone." The look of pure, unadulterated terror that crossed his face told her everything she needed to know. The seesaw was about to plummet, and neither of them was ready for the fall. The air in the holding room had grown thick, saturated with the metallic scent of static and the cloying sweetness of rotting lilies, the unmistakable odor of ancient, decaying magic. Hermione sat at her desk, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across the diagram of the ritual of equivalence. It was a jagged, cruel thing, a geometric trap designed by wizards who believed that balance could only be achieved through suffering. Across the room, Draco was a silhouette of misery. He hadn't moved for hours, slumped against the wall in a state of semi-consciousness. The black veins had reached his throat now, tracing thin spiderweb lines toward his jaw. "The ritual," Draco rasped. his eyes remaining closed. "Explain it. No more metaphors, Granger. What does it actually demand?" Hermione swallowed hard, her throat feeling as though it were lined with sand. She stood up, crossing the room with the heavy, reluctant steps of a prisoner walking toward the gallows. She stopped a few feet away from him, the invisible barrier of his hostility keeping her at bay. "It's an alchemical transfer," she began, her voice professional and thin. "The curse is a debt of blood. To cancel it, the magic needs to be tricked into thinking the debt has been paid by a source it cannot consume. It needs a vessel of new blood, someone whose magical genealogy doesn't carry the markers of the Malfoy line." Draco's eyes snapped open. They were bloodshot, the silver irises appearing almost white in the gloom. "You." "Me," she confirmed, her hands clenching in the folds of her robes. "The ritual requires a physical conduit. I have to act as a filter for your magical core. I take the corruption in. My magic neutralizes the stain of the debt because it doesn't recognize the law of pure blood inheritance. And then I pass the cleansed energy back to you." A silence stretched between them, so profound it felt as though the world outside the ministry had ceased to exist. "And the risk?" Draco asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If the transfer isn't perfectly synchronized, if there is a moment of doubt, or if our cores reject each other, the magic will backfire. It will tear my mind apart and leave you a hollow shell. We have to be perfectly aligned." Draco let out a jagged, broken laugh that turned into a coughing fit. When he pulled his hand away from his mouth, there were flecks of black ichor on his palm. "Perfectly aligned? You and me? We've spent 7 years trying to destroy each other, and 3 years trying to forget the other exists. We are the definition of misalignment." "I know," she whispered, looking down at his trembling hands. "But I've run the numbers 1,000 times, Draco. This is the only way. Your magic is already failing. By tomorrow morning, the curse will reach your heart." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the mask of the arrogant boy she had known at school finally dissolved. Beneath it was a man who was utterly, terrifyingly alone. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, trembling. "Why would you risk your mind for me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "After everything, after the manor. Why, Hermione?" It was the first time he had used her given name without a sneer or a shield of irony. It felt like a confession. Hermione felt a wave of heat rise in her chest, a sudden fierce protectiveness that defied logic. "Because no one should have to die for the sins of their ancestors," she said, her voice gaining strength. "And because I refuse to believe that you are beyond saving." She took the final step, closing the distance. She reached out and took his hand. This time, there was no violent jolt, only a deep, thrumming ache. His skin was freezing, but his grip was desperate, his fingers lacing through hers as if he were a drowning man. "Tell me what to do," he whispered. "We have to begin tonight," she said. "The moon is in the correct phase. I've prepared the chalk and the candles. But Draco, there can be no secrets during the transfer. The magic will open our minds to each other. You will see everything, and so will I." The fear in his eyes intensified. For a man like Draco Malfoy, who had spent a lifetime building walls and polishing a facade, the thought of being seen, truly seen, was worse than death. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I have things in my head, things that will make you turn away," he muttered. "I've fought a war, Draco. I've seen the worst of humanity. I think I can handle your thoughts." She began to draw the ritual circle around them, her wand movements precise and rhythmic. She placed candles at the 7 cardinal points of the soul, their flames burning a strange, brilliant violet. The air began to hum, the stone floor vibrating beneath their feet. "Sit," she commanded softly. They sat cross-legged, facing each other in the center of the circle. The space felt impossibly small. Their knees brushed, and the scent of the ritual incense, myrrh and bitter almond, wrapped around them like a shroud. "Give me both your hands," Hermione said. Draco hesitated, then placed his hands in hers. His palms were damp with sweat, his pulse racing. Hermione closed her eyes and began the incantation, the ancient Latin words rolling off her tongue like a prayer. "Sanguis ad sanguinem, anima ad animam, quod est fractum redintegretur." The world vanished. Suddenly, Hermione wasn't in the holding room anymore. She was in a whirlwind of silver and grey. She felt a crushing weight on her chest, the weight of Malfoy Manor, the cold eyes of Lucius, the terrifying, high-pitched laugh of Bellatrix. She felt the searing pain of the dark mark being burned into her skin, the shame of a boy who wanted to be a hero but was only a coward. She felt his hunger, not for food, but for a single word of kindness. She felt his secret, hidden admiration for the girl who had punched him in 3rd year, the girl who was everything he wasn't allowed to be. Across the link, Draco gasped. He was drowning in her memories. He felt the warmth of the burrow, the fierce loyalty she felt for Harry and Ron, the crushing loneliness of being the smartest witch of her age, whom everyone relied on, but no one truly understood. He felt the jagged, raw edge of the scar on her arm, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. She was using the very arm he had helped ruin to save his life. The magic surged. The black ink on Draco's arm began to liquefy, turning into a smoky mist that flowed across their joined hands and into Hermione's skin. She screamed. It felt like liquid fire was being poured into her veins. Her head snapped back, her eyes glowing with a reflected violet light. "Hermione! Break it! Stop!" Draco shouted, trying to pull his hands away. "No!" she gasped, her grip tightening until her nails drew blood from his palms. "If we break it now, we both die. Hold on. Draco, hold on to me." She saw his memories of her, not as a rival, but as a light he had been too afraid to approach. She saw him watching her in the library, his heart aching with a jealousy he couldn't name. She saw him in the room of requirement, his wand trembling, praying he wouldn't have to kill. The pain reached a crescendo. Hermione felt her own magic buckling under the weight of the Malfoy curse. It was too much. The darkness was too heavy. It began to cloud her vision, whispering that she was a fool, that she was nothing, that she deserved to bleed. "Help me," she projected into his mind, a silent plea. Draco didn't hesitate. He threw aside his shields. He poured everything he had, every ounce of his remaining strength, every shred of his will, into the bond. He didn't just give her his magic. He gave her his soul. He wrapped his mental presence around hers, a shield of silver ice protecting her from the black fire. "I've got you," his voice echoed in her mind, steady and sure. "I won't let it take you." The shift was instantaneous. The seesaw slammed into a position of total, terrifying trust. The darkness began to recede, neutralized by the sheer force of their combined will. The black mist turned to white light, flowing back into Draco, knitting his damaged core back together. The ritual circle flared one last time and then extinguished. Silence reclaimed the room. They were both slumped over, their foreheads touching, their hands still locked together. They were gasping for air, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. Hermione opened her eyes. The violet glow was gone, but her vision was still blurred by tears. She looked down at Draco's arm. The black veins had vanished. The skin was pale and smooth, the dark mark nothing more than a faint silver scar. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice a mere thread. Draco lifted his head. He looked transformed. The grey in his skin had been replaced by a faint flush of life. But his eyes were full of a raw, exposed emotion that made Hermione's heart stop. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached up, his thumb grazing her cheek, catching a stray tear. The touch was light, tentative, and utterly devoid of the malice that had defined them for a decade. "You saw," he whispered. "You saw everything." "Yes," she replied, her heart hammering. "I saw." The tension in the room was no longer about magic or curses. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of two people who knew each other too well to ever go back to being enemies. Draco's hand lingered on her face, his fingers trembling. He looked at her lips, then back to her eyes, a silent question hanging in the air. Hermione felt herself leaning in, drawn by a gravity she no longer wanted to fight. But just as their lips were about to meet, the heavy oak door of the holding room burst open. "Granger! Report!" The voice of Kingsley Shacklebolt shattered the moment like a hammer to glass. Draco flinched, pulling back instantly, the mask of the cold aristocrat slamming back into place so fast it made Hermione's head spin. He scrambled to his feet, turning his back to the door, while Hermione struggled to stand, her legs feeling like water. The ritual was successful, Minister," she stammered, smoothing her robes with shaking hands. Kingsley stepped into the room, followed by two auras. He looked at the chalk circles, the burnt-out candles, and the pale, silent man standing in the corner. "Good," Kingsley said, though his eyes remained suspicious. "Malfoy, you're being transferred to a secure wing at St. Mungo's for observation. Granger, you're relieved. Go home. You look like death." Hermione looked at Draco. He wouldn't look at her. He stood perfectly still, his shoulders rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. The warmth of the ritual might as well have been a dream. "Malfoy," she said softly. "Go home, Granger," he said, his voice cold and flat, devoid of any of the tenderness they had just shared. "The job is done." As the auras led him out of the room, Hermione stood alone in the dark, the scent of bitter almond still clinging to her clothes. The seesaw had swung back to cold, but she could still feel the phantom pressure of his thumb on her cheek. She knew the truth now, and she knew that for Draco Malfoy, the hardest part wasn't surviving the curse. It was surviving the fact that she was the one who had saved him. The game was far from over. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries always smelled the same. A pungent clinical mixture of antiseptic, dried lavender, and the underlying metallic tang of stray spells. For Hermione, the scent usually brought a sense of order, but tonight it felt like a cage. A week had passed since the ritual. a week since she had looked into the darkest corners of Draco Malfoy's soul and found not a monster, but a mirror of her own loneliness. She had been barred from his room in the Janus Thicky ward under the guise of recovery protocol. But she knew the truth. The Ministry was terrified of the bond they had glimpsed. A bond between the brightest star of the new world and the tarnished air of the old. She stood outside room 402, her fingers curling around a folder of arithmancy charts she didn't need. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She told herself she was here for a follow-up. She told herself it was her duty as an unspeakable. She was lying. She pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the pale, sickly glow of a London moon. Draco was sitting by the window, staring out at the skyline. He wasn't wearing his usual black. He was in a white hospital tunic that made him look painfully fragile. The sharp lines of his profile were etched in silver. "The Auras said you wouldn't come," he said without turning. His voice was stronger than it had been in the cell, but it carried a jagged edge of bitterness. "The Auras don't dictate my schedule, Malfoy," Hermione replied, closing the door softly. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the silence. He turned his head then, and the air left her lungs. He looked healthy. The black rot was gone, replaced by the natural porcelain pallor of his skin. But his eyes were haunted. The mental bridge they had built hadn't collapsed. It had just gone quiet. She could still feel him, a low-frequency hum at the back of her mind. "Why are you here, Hermione?" He used her name again, but this time it wasn't a plea. It was an accusation. He stood up, his movements fluid and predatory, and walked toward her. He stopped just inches away, invading her personal space until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I needed to check the stabilization of your core," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. She held up the folder like a shield. "The ritual was experimental. If there's any residual..." "Liar." He reached out and took the folder from her hands, tossing it onto the bed without looking at it. He stepped closer, forcing her to look up at him. "You're here because you can still feel it. Because every time your heart beats, you wonder if it's yours or mine. Because you can't stand the thought that I know exactly what you look like when you're afraid." Hermione's breath hitched. "It's a side effect of the transfer, Draco. It will fade." "Will it?" He leaned down, his face so close to hers she could see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes. "Because I can feel your pulse racing right now. I can feel the way your magic is reaching out for mine, trying to spark that connection again. It's disgusting, isn't it? That you crave the very thing you're supposed to hate." The seesaw swung violently toward repulsion. The cruelty in his voice was a defense mechanism, a wall built of glass and spite. Hermione felt a flash of hot, indignant anger. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her eyes flashing. "Don't you dare try to make me feel ashamed for saving your life. You're so terrified of someone actually knowing you that you'd rather poison the air between us than admit you're grateful." "Grateful?" Draco barked a laugh, though it sounded like a sob. He grabbed her upper arms, his fingers digging into the fabric of her robes. "You didn't just save me, Granger. You colonized me. I can't sleep because I see your memories of the war. I see the cellar of my own house through your eyes. I feel your pain, your terror, and your pity. I'd rather have died than have your pity living inside my head." "It's not," pity, she shouted, trying to shake him off. Then what is it? He roared back. He shook her slightly, his face a mask of desperation and fury. Tell me what it is. Tell me why you stayed when the magic started to burn. Tell me why you looked at me like I was something worth keeping. The tension between them snapped. The anger, the fear, the weeks of suppressed trauma and forced proximity boiled over. Hermione didn't think. She reacted. She reached up, grabbing the front of his tunic and pulled him down. She didn't kiss him. She pressed her forehead against his, her eyes shut tight, her body shaking with the force of her own emotions. "Because I saw you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I saw the boy who cried in the bathroom because he couldn't kill a man. I saw the man who stayed in the manor to protect his mother. I saw the person you could have been if the world hadn't tried to break you first. And I couldn't let that person disappear." The silence that followed was agonizing. Draco's grip on her arms loosened, his fingers now ghosting over her skin in a tentative, disbelieving caress. His breath was ragged, hitching in his chest. "You're a fool," he whispered, but the venom was gone. There was only a profound, aching vulnerability. He let his head drop, burying his face in the crook of her neck. Hermione felt a sob escape her throat as she wrapped her arms around him, holding him as if he might shatter into 1,000 pieces. For the first time, the warmth wasn't a ritualistic requirement. It was real. It was heavy. It was terrifying. They stood there for a long time, two broken soldiers finding a strange, quiet peace in the middle of a hospital room. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was more overwhelming than the ritual itself. The way his hair felt against her cheek, the way his hands settled on her waist, it was a language they hadn't learned but somehow understood. But then Draco pulled back, not with anger this time, but with a cold, hollow sadness. "They're going to clear me for release tomorrow," he said, staring at a point over her shoulder. "My mother has arranged for me to go to our estate in France, to recuperate." Hermione felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "France? But the ministry hasn't finished the debriefing. I haven't finished the—" "It's over, Hermione." He looked at her, and his eyes were like shuttered windows. The wall was back up, higher and thicker than before. "The debt is paid. The curse is gone. You've done your job. Is that all this was to you? A job?" "It's what it has to be," he said, his voice flat. He stepped away from her, putting the cold, sterile distance of the room back between them. "I'm a Malfoy. You're you. The world doesn't have a place for what happened in that cell. If you stay, if you keep coming here, they will ruin you. They will say you were compromised. They'll take your career, your reputation, everything you worked for. I don't care about that." "Well, I do," he snapped. "I won't be the reason you lose everything twice." He turned back to the window, his silhouette dark against the city lights. "Go home, Granger. Forget the sins of Pureblood. Forget me." Hermione stood frozen. The seesaw had hit the bottom of the betrayal/doubt phase. She looked at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders, and she felt a sudden, sharp realization. He wasn't pushing her away because he hated her. He was pushing her away because he thought he was protecting her. It was the ultimate Malfoy arrogance, and it was the ultimate sacrifice. "You think you're being noble," she said, her voice dripping with a bitter, quiet anger. But you're just being a coward. You're running away because you're too afraid to see if we could actually be something when we aren't dying." He didn't move. He didn't speak. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling. "Go to France. Run back to your mother and your titles. But don't you dare pretend you're doing this for me." She turned and walked out of the room, the sound of her heels on the linoleum floor echoing like the ticking of a clock. She didn't look back. If she had, she would have seen Draco Malfoy collapse against the window pane, his forehead resting against the glass, his hand clutching the place on his arm where the curse used to be, and where her touch still burned. As the lift doors closed, Hermione felt the mental link stretch, thinning until it was a single, fragile thread. She realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't sure if she wanted it to break, or if she was going to spend the rest of her life trying to pull him back along it. The chapter of the ministry was closed, but the haunting of Draco Malfoy had only just begun. The winter in London was a cruel, damp thing, but it was nothing compared to the sterile silence that had settled over Hermione's life. 3 months had passed since the doors of St. Mungo's had closed between her and Draco Malfoy. She had returned to her work at the ministry, burying herself in ancient texts and arithmancy equations until her eyes ached and her fingers were stained with ink. She told everyone she was fine. She told herself she was relieved. But the thread remained. It was a phantom limb, a low-frequency vibration at the base of her skull. Sometimes, in the quiet of her flat, she would feel a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows, an echo of Draco's loneliness. Other times she would catch the scent of bitter almonds in the middle of a crowded street and find herself breathless, searching the faces of strangers for a shock of platinum hair. Then the letter arrived. It wasn't delivered by a ministry owl, but by a sleek black eagle owl that looked out of place in the cramped confines of her kitchen. The parchment was heavy, cream-coloured, and bore no crest, only her name written in a sharp, elegant hand that she recognized with a jolt of visceral adrenaline. The ritual was incomplete. The rot has returned to the gardens, and the shadows are speaking again. I cannot ask this of you, but I have no one else who understands the language of this death. If you do not come, let the records show I did not go quietly. D. The seesaw swung with a violent force. Anger. How dare he? How dare he push her away with such calculated cruelty, only to beckon her back when the shadows grew too long? Fear. Was he dying again? Had she failed? Doubt. Was this a trap, a Malfoy ploy to regain standing? And beneath it all, a traitorous, pounding thirst to see him again. 24 hours later, Hermione found herself standing at the edge of the Malfoy estate in southern France, Le Domaine de l'Ombre. It was a far cry from the oppressive gloom of Malfoy Manor in Wiltshire. This was a sprawling white stone villa perched on a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean. But as she stepped past the iron gates, she felt it. The air was too still. The scent of the lavender fields was being choked out by the familiar, cloying sweetness of decaying magic. "You came," a voice said from the shadows of a marble colonnade. Draco stepped into the moonlight. He wasn't the fragile patient from the hospital, but he wasn't the polished aristocrat either. He was dressed in a simple white shirt and dark trousers, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked older, his face leaner, his eyes reflecting the dark sea behind him. I didn't come for you, Hermione said, her voice sounding brittle even to her own ears. She clutched her travel bag tighter. I came because I won't have a failed ritual on my record. I came for the magic, Malfoy. Of course, he drawled, but there was no bite in it. He walked toward her, and as he entered her personal space, the thread in her mind tightened, humming with a sudden, painful resonance. He stopped just short of touching her. The unspeakable and her record. God forbid you leave a mystery unsolved. What's happening? She asked, looking around. The white stones of the villa seemed to be weeping a dark, oily substance. The ritual was supposed to ground the curse. Your core was clean. My core is clean, Draco said, his voice dropping an octave. He stepped closer, and she could smell the sea salt and the faint underlying scent of him, the one that haunted her dreams. But the house isn't. This estate, it belonged to the Black family branch. My mother thought it was a sanctuary, but it's a reservoir. It's feeding on the connection we created. It's trying to finish what the Wiltshire curse started. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. Hermione didn't flinch. She watched him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The tension between them was a physical presence, a thick electrical charge that made the hair on her arms stand up. It wants the bridge, Hermione, he whispered. It's not enough to kill me anymore. It wants the union. It's hungry for the new blood it tasted during the transfer. Why didn't you tell me this before I stepped inside the wards? She demanded, a flare of the old enemy suspicion rising in her chest. You've trapped me here. Draco's eyes darkened, a flash of genuine hurt crossing his features before he masked it with a sneer. I told you to forget me, remember? I told you to stay in London. You chose to come. You chose the mystery over your safety. Don't blame me for your own curiosity, Granger. He turned on his heel and began walking toward the house. Your room is in the east wing. The wards are strongest there. We'll begin the analysis tomorrow. Try not to wander into the gardens. The roses have developed a taste for blood. Hermione followed him, her mind racing. The seesaw was in full motion now. Approach and repulsion, trust and betrayal. She saw the way he walked, the slight stiffness in his shoulders, the way he kept his hands clenched at his sides, as if afraid to touch anything. He was a man under siege, and yet he still had the audacity to be arrogant. The villa was beautiful and terrifying. Tapestries shimmered with unsettled magic, and the candlelight flickered even when there was no breeze. When they reached the door to her quarters, Draco paused. He didn't look at her, but he didn't leave. The link, he said quietly, his back to her. How loud is it for you? Hermione leaned against the doorframe, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. It's a hum, constant. Sometimes I feel your heart rate spike when the sun goes down. Draco turned slowly. The moonlight caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone. It's a roar for me, he confessed, his voice raw. I can hear your thoughts when you're angry. I can feel the exact moment you wake up in the morning. It's a violation, isn't it? To be so tethered. Is that why you sent for me? She asked softly. Because you were lonely, or because you wanted to break the tether? He stepped toward her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. He reached out, and this time he didn't stop. His fingers brushed against the scar on her arm, the one hidden beneath her sleeve. Even through the fabric, the contact was like a bolt of lightning. "I sent for you because I'm a selfish man, Hermione," he whispered, leaning in until his lips were inches from her ear. "I'm a Malfoy. We take what we need to survive. And right now, I need you to be the anchor." He didn't wait for a response. He pulled back, his face a mask of cold indifference once more, and vanished into the shadows of the hallway. Hermione retreated into her room, locking the door and leaning her head against the wood. Her skin was prickling where he had touched her. She could feel him, just down the hall, his pulse racing, his mind a chaotic storm of guilt and desire. The sins of pure blood were no longer just an abstract curse. They were here, in this house, in the way he said her name, in the way she had crossed an ocean just to stand in his shadow. As she lay in the oversized bed, listening to the waves crash against the cliffs below, she realized with a start that the curse wasn't the only thing that had returned. The "can't help but think" had become a "can't live without." The slow burn was turning into a wildfire, and the air in the villa was running out. The Mediterranean moon was a cruel witness, casting a silver pallor over the gardens of Le Domaine de l'Ombre. Hermione could not sleep. The villa itself seemed to be breathing, a heavy, rhythmic expansion and contraction of stone and ivy that echoed the thrumming in her own veins. The mental link was no longer a hum. It was a rhythmic pulse, dragging her heart into synchronization with someone else's. She found herself wandering the marble terraces, the hem of her silk nightgown catching on the thorns of roses that were a red so dark they looked black. The air was thick with the scent of salt and ancient, sour magic. "I told you not to wander," a voice rasped from the darkness of a cypress grove. Draco was standing by a fountain that wept black water. He was shirtless, his pale skin gleaming like polished bone in the moonlight. Across his chest and back, the black veins had reappeared, but they weren't stagnant. They were moving, swirling in patterns that mimicked the constellations above. "It's worse at night, isn't it?" Hermione said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't stop until she was standing at the edge of the fountain, the spray of the corrupted water chilling her skin. The house. It's not just a reservoir, Draco. It's a mirror. It's reflecting the parts of us we tried to bury in London. Draco turned to her, his eyes blown wide, the silver irises almost swallowed by the black of his pupils. He looked feral, stripped of the Malfoy armor he had worn since birth. "It's hungry, Hermione. It remembers the taste of you. It remembers how your magic felt when it tried to purge the debt." He took a step toward her, his movements jerky, as if he were fighting his own limbs. "Every time I look at you, the house screams. It wants me to take. It wants me to reclaim the purity by consuming the taint. Do you understand how hard I'm trying not to touch you?" The seesaw swung with a violent, terrifying force, approach and repulsion. The air between them was so charged with static that Hermione's hair began to lift from her shoulders. She should have run. She should have retreated to the safety of the wards. But the "can't help but think" had reached a fever pitch. "Is that what you call it?" she challenged, her own anger rising to meet his. "Touching me. You think your touch is a weapon, Draco. You think you're so inherently poisoned that any proximity to me is a sin. That's not the house speaking. That's your own cowardice." "Cowardice?" He lunged forward, his hands slamming into the marble rim of the fountain on either side of her, trapping her. The heat radiating from his body was an agonizing contrast to the midnight air. I spent my life being told I was better than you, only to find out I wasn't fit to breathe the same air. I watched you bleed on my floor. I let you save my soul. And now, every breath I take is a reminder that I belong to you. Not to the Malfoys, not to the Ministry, to you. The admission was a jagged shard of glass. His face was inches from hers, his breath hitching in his chest. Hermione could see the individual lashes of his eyes, the fine tremor in his jaw. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was suffocating. The silence was heavy, filled with the things they hadn't said. I missed you. I hate that I need you. I'm terrified of what we are. Then stop fighting it, she whispered. She reached up, her fingers ghosting over the black veins on his chest. The moment her skin met his, the house let out a literal groan. The wind died. The water in the fountain froze. The contact was a revelation. It wasn't the searing pain of the ritual. It was an explosion of sensory information. She felt his grief for his mother, his disgust with his father's legacy, and a sudden, sharp burst of localized, agonizing desire for her that made her head light. Draco let out a broken sound, half sob, half growl. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin there. "I'll ruin you," he choked out. "The world will never forgive you for this. I will be the stain you can never wash off." "Let them talk," Hermione said, her hands sliding up to grip his hair, pulling him closer until there was no air left between them. "I've spent my whole life doing what was right, Draco. For once, I want what is mine." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression a chaotic mix of worship and self-loathing. The tension reached its breaking point. The can't stand it finally buckled under the can't help but think. He didn't kiss her yet. Instead, he took her hand and pressed it against the center of his chest, right over his heart. The black veins beneath his skin seemed to quiet, retreating under her touch as if they were being tamed. "The debt isn't blood, Hermione," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It was never about the blood. It was about the lack of love. The Malfoys. We only ever loved power. We only ever loved the image of ourselves." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "But when you touched me in that cell, you gave me something else. And the house hates it, because love is the only thing it can't corrupt." The seesaw tipped toward warmth. For a few heartbeats, the gardens felt like a sanctuary rather than a trap. Hermione felt a tear escape her eye and slide down her cheek. Draco caught it with his thumb, his touch unexpectedly tender, his eyes fixed on hers with a desperate, searching hope. "Stay," he breathed. "Not for the ritual, not for the ministry. Stay because the silence is too loud without you." But as the words left his lips, the black veins on his chest flared with a sudden, violent violet light. Draco gasped, his body jerking back as if he had been struck. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his heart, his face contorting in agony. "Draco!" Hermione cried, reaching for him. "No! Stay back!" he shouted, his voice distorted by the magic. It's the final shift. The house. It's trying to reclaim the energy. It's forcing the equivalence." The ground beneath them began to tremble. The white stones of the villa started to crack, and the black water in the fountain erupted into a geyser of shadow. The seesaw slammed back into betrayal/doubt. Had he known this would happen? Was his confession just a trigger for the final stage of the curse? Hermione stood her ground, her wand drawn, the light of her magic clashing with the darkness of the estate. She looked at Draco, who was being swallowed by the shadows, his eyes wide with a terror that was all too real. The ritual isn't over, she realized, her voice rising above the roar of the wind. The sacrifice wasn't my blood, Draco. It was yours. You have to let go of the name. You have to let go of the Malfoy legacy, or it will take us both. I don't know how, he screamed, the shadows crawling up his throat. Trust me, she yelled, reaching into the darkness for his hand. Draco, look at me. Forget the sins. Just look at me. The cliffhanger was no longer a question of survival. It was a question of identity. As the shadows threatened to consume them both, the thread between their minds stretched to its absolute limit, vibrating with the force of a choice that had been 3 generations in the making. Hermione's fingers brushed his, and the world exploded into a blinding, suffocating white. The white light did not fade so much as it dissolved, leaving behind a world that felt raw and stripped of its skin. Hermione opened her eyes to find herself lying on the scorched grass of the terrace. The air was unnervingly still. The villa, once a proud monument of white stone and arrogance, looked different. The oily weeping had stopped, but the walls were now covered in deep, jagged fissures, like a face that had aged 100 years in a single heartbeat. A few feet away, Draco lay motionless. Draco! Her voice was a cracked reed. She scrambled toward him on her knees, her silk gown torn and stained with soot. He was breathing, but it was a shallow, rattling sound. The black veins were gone, but in their place was something even more unsettling. He was deathly pale, his skin almost translucent, and the silver of his hair seemed to have lost its metallic luster, turning the color of ash. Hermione reached out, her hand trembling. When she touched his shoulder, a jolt of cold realization shot through her. The mental link, the thrumming, constant presence of him in her mind, was gone. The silence was deafening. It felt as if a limb had been severed without anesthesia. Draco, please, she sobbed, pulling his head into her lap. Don't you dare do this. Don't you dare leave me in this silence. His eyelids fluttered. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were no longer the piercing grey of a storm. They were a soft, muted slate. He looked at her with a confusion that slowly sharpened into recognition, and then into a profound, hollow grief. It's quiet, he whispered. He tried to lift his hand to her face, but his strength failed him. The ancestors. I can't hear them anymore. The house. It's dead, Hermione. You did it, she said, tears blurring her vision. You let go. You chose to be no one. I'm nothing, he rasped, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. I have no magic, Granger. I can feel the core. It's empty. I gave it all to the debt. The seesaw plummeted into a terrifying new depth, cold and despair. He had survived, but at the cost of the very thing that defined his world. A wizard without magic was a ghost in the wizarding world, a shadow of a man. Hermione felt a crushing weight of guilt. Had she forced this on him? Had her insistence on his salvation stripped him of his essence? You're alive, she insisted, pressing her forehead against his. That's all that matters. We can find a way. I can... You can what? Draco's voice regained a sliver of its old bite, though it was softened by exhaustion. He pulled himself away from her, sitting up with great effort. He leaned against the stone fountain, which was now dry and crumbling. "You'll study me. You'll write a paper on the first pureblood to intentionally become a squib. You'll keep me as a project in your laboratory? That's not what I meant, and you know it. Is it?" He looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was almost too much to bear. "Look at you, Hermione. You are the brightest witch of the age. You are power and light and future. And I am a stain, a man without a name, without a fortune, and now without a wand. The equivalence is complete. I am as low as you were told you were. Are you satisfied?" The seesaw swung toward betrayal. He was lashing out, using his own pain as a weapon to push her away again. It was the old Draco, the one who used cruelty as a shield. But Hermione wasn't the girl she had been. She saw the tremor in his hands. She saw the way he was looking at her, not with hate, but with a desperate, agonizing fear that she would realize he was no longer worthy of her. "You think my feelings for you were tied to your magic?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. She stood up, looking down at him, her anger flaring like a torch. "You think I stayed in that cell and crossed an ocean because of your bloodline or your seat in the Wizengamot?" "It's all I had," he shouted, the effort causing him to wince. "It was the cage you lived in," she retorted. "You're finally free, Draco. For the first time in your life, you can choose who you want to be. And you're choosing to be a victim. You're choosing to be a martyr." She stepped into his space, her shadow falling over him. The tension was no longer magical. It was purely, devastatingly human. The air between them was thick with the scent of the sea and the smoke of the burnt garden. "I didn't save a Malfoy," she whispered, leaning down until their faces were inches apart. "I saved a boy who once showed me a moment of mercy in a drawing room. I saved a man who looked at me in a ministry cell and saw a person, not a category. If you can't see that man without a wand in his hand, then you're the one who is blind, not me." Draco stared at her, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. The silence between them stretched, filled with the "can't help but think" that had plagued them for months. He looked at her lips, then back to her eyes, his resolve crumbling. "I don't know how to be that man," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I'm afraid, Hermione. Without the magic, I can't feel you. The link is gone. I'm alone in my own head." "You're not alone," she said, reaching out and taking his hand. His skin was warm now, humanly warm, not the unnatural chill of the curse. She pressed his palm against her cheek. "I'm right here. You don't need a spell to find me." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. The seesaw began to stabilize, moving toward a fragile, aching trust. He turned his hand, his fingers curling around the back of her neck, pulling her closer. It was a slow, tentative movement, devoid of the frantic desperation of the garden. "I have nothing to give you," he whispered against her skin. "You're here," she replied. "That's plenty." The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. The way he breathed in her scent, the way his thumb traced the line of her jaw. It was a confession of a different kind. They were two people standing in the wreckage of a dynasty, stripped of their titles and their history, left with nothing but the raw, pulsing truth of their existence. Draco opened his eyes, and for the first time, the walls were truly down. There was no mask, no sneer, no protective layer of arrogance. There was only Draco. "Stay with me," he said. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. Just for tonight, before the world finds us, before the ministry and the newspapers and the reality of what I've become sets in. Stay in the silence with me. Hermione felt a wave of tenderness so strong it made her ache. She sat back down on the grass, pulling him into her arms. They stayed there as the moon began its descent toward the horizon, two silhouettes against the crumbling white stone of the villa. But as the first hint of dawn began to grey the sky, a sharp, metallic crack echoed through the grounds. Hermione's hand flew to her wand. 3 figures in dark ministry robes were standing at the edge of the terrace. Their wands were drawn, the tips glowing with a cold blue light. "Hermione Granger," the lead aura called out, his voice amplified by magic. "And Draco Malfoy. By order of the Ministry of Magic, you are both under arrest for the unauthorized use of Class A blood magic and the destruction of a protected historical site." Draco stiffened in her arms, his face hardening. He looked at the auras, then at his own empty hands. The reality he had feared was arriving earlier than expected. "Go," he whispered to her. "Tell them I forced you. Tell them you were under a compulsion. You still have your life, Hermione. Don't let them take it for me." Hermione looked at the auras, then back at the man who was willing to lose her to save her. She felt the seesaw lock into place. There was no more repulsion. There was no more doubt. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady and clear. She stood up, her hands still locked in his, facing the light of the rising sun and the wands of her former colleagues. The sins of pure blood had been paid for. Now, the price of their future was about to be set. The courtroom of the Wizengamot was a vertical tomb of cold, dark stone and judgmental eyes. Hermione stood in the center of the floor, the heavy chains of the witness chair rattling only slightly as she moved. Beside her sat Draco, his posture rigid, his face a mask of marble. He was a man stripped of his magic, yet in the shadows of the underground chamber he had never looked more like a king, or perhaps a martyr. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and the ozone of the truth-detecting enchantments humming in the walls. For 3 days they had been picked apart. The ministry sought a villain. They found a tragedy. They sought a crime. They found a sacrifice. "Miss Granger," Kingsley Shacklebolt's voice boomed from the high bench. He looked tired, his eyes reflecting a deep disappointment that cut Hermione more than any curse. "You are an unspeakable. You were sent to contain a threat, not to merge your soul with it. You performed an alchemical transfer that has permanently altered the magical signature of a sacred 28 bloodline. Do you have any defense for this recklessness?" Hermione looked up. She didn't look at the minister or the rows of wizened faces in plum-colored robes. She looked at Draco. He was staring straight ahead, but his hand was resting on the arm of his chair, just inches from hers. She could feel the ghost of the link, not the magic, but the memory of it. "I didn't alter a bloodline, Minister," Hermione said, her voice echoing with a clarity that silenced the murmurs of the court. "I ended a plague. The sins of pure blood were not a heritage. They were a death sentence. Draco Malfoy didn't lose his magic. He gave it as payment for a debt he didn't owe. If the law finds a crime in survival, then the law is the only thing here that needs fixing." A ripple of outrage and shock went through the room. Draco's hand twitched, his fingers finally finding hers, gripping them with a strength that grounded her. "And what of the bond?" a member of the court demanded. "You are tethered to him. Is this not a conflict of interest, a corruption of your office?" Hermione turned toward the voice. "It is not a corruption to see the humanity in an enemy. It is a victory. The war ended 3 years ago, but we have been fighting it every day since in our own heads. This bond, it's not a tether. It's the only thing that's real in a world full of ghosts." The deliberations lasted for hours. Hermione and Draco were led to a small holding cell in the basement of the Ministry, a place far less grim than the one where their journey had begun. There was a single wooden bench. They sat close, their shoulders touching, the silence between them no longer heavy but protective. "You're going to lose your job," Draco said quietly, his eyes fixed on the stone floor. "They'll strip you of your clearance. You'll be lucky if they let you work in a bookstore in Diagon Alley." "I like books, Draco," she replied, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "And I'm quite good at organizing things. I think I'll manage." "You shouldn't have to manage. You were supposed to be the minister one day." He turned to her, his face pained. "I took that from you. I took your light to fill my darkness." Hermione reached out, her fingers sliding into his hair, drawing his gaze to hers. "You didn't take anything. I gave it. And for the record, the light is much brighter now that I don't have to carry it alone." The door creaked open. Kingsley stood there, his expression unreadable. "The court has reached a verdict. Because of the unique nature of the curse and the fact that the Malfoy estate has effectively been neutralized as a dark site, the charges of unauthorized magic are dropped." A breath of relief escaped Draco, but Kingsley wasn't finished. "However," the minister continued, "Mr. Malfoy is barred from holding any magical office or possessing a wand for a period of 10 years. And, Miss Granger, your resignation from the Department of Mysteries has been accepted, effective immediately. You are both to remain under a 5-year period of observation." "We accept," Draco said before Hermione could speak. Kingsley looked at them, really looked at them, and for a fleeting second the stern minister vanished, replaced by the man who had fought alongside them. "Go," he whispered, "before they change their minds." They emerged from the Ministry into the late afternoon sun of London. The noise of the city, the red buses, the shouting tourists, the mundane chaos of the Muggle world swirled around them. For Draco, it was a sensory assault. He flinched at the sound of a car horn, his lack of magical shielding making him feel raw. Hermione didn't hesitate. She stepped into his space, her arms sliding around his waist, pulling him into the shelter of her body. "It's okay," she murmured. "We'll take it slow." They walked toward the river, the Thames shimmering like liquid lead under the setting sun. They found a secluded spot under a willow tree, its long branches creating a curtain of green that cut them off from the world. The tension that had sustained them through the trial, the ritual, and the months of separation finally broke. Draco turned to her, his back against the rough bark of the tree. He looked at her with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "I have no magic," he whispered, his hands trembling as they settled on her waist. "I have no name. I have nothing but this." "It's more than enough," Hermione replied, her heart hammering a frantic, joyous rhythm. She reached up, her hands framing his face. her thumbs tracing the lines of his mouth. The seesaw had finally stopped. The repulsion was gone. The doubt was dead. There was only this, the approach that would never end. Draco leaned down, his eyes searching hers one last time for any sign of regret. Finding none, he finally closed the gap. The kiss was not like the magic. It wasn't an explosion or a shockwave. It was slow, deep, and tasted of salt and home. It was the sound of a door closing on the past and a window opening on a world where they were just two people, bruised and broken, but finally, undeniably free. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hitching. "I've wanted to do that since third year," he confessed with a ragged laugh, "even when I was calling you every name in the book." "I know," she whispered, a tear of relief sliding down her cheek. "I felt it in the link, remember?" "I'm glad it's gone," Draco said, kissing her temple, his arms tightening around her as if he would never let go. "The link. I don't want to feel you through magic anymore. I want to learn you the hard way, through words, through time." "We have plenty of that," Hermione said. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and bruised gold, the same colors as the magic they had faced together. But as the first stars appeared, they weren't looking at the sky. They were looking at each other. The sins of pure blood were a memory. The future was a blank page, and for the first time in their lives, they were the ones holding the pen. In the quiet of the London evening, under the shadow of the willow, there were no more unspeakables and no more Death Eaters. There was only a girl who had saved a boy, and a boy who had finally found something worth being saved for. They kissed again, a promise, a seal, a beginning. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. The cottage was a sanctuary of peeling white paint and overgrown jasmine, tucked away on the edge of a coastal village where the Atlantic mist blurred the line between the sky and the sea. Here, the world did not care about the Wizengamot or the weight of a family crest. But inside the four walls of their new life, the silence was often heavier than the noise of London. For Hermione, the transition was a physical ache. She had spent a decade fueled by the hum of magic, the vibration of a wand in her pocket, and the constant, rapid-fire calculations of a brilliant mind. Now, she worked in a tiny, dust-choked bookshop in the village, cataloguing local history for muggles who had no idea she had once helped save their world. For Draco, the transition was an amputation. He sat by the fireplace, the orange light flickering across the sharp planes of his face. He was holding a kitchen knife, carefully peeling an apple, a mundane, repetitive task that would have taken a flick of his fingers a year ago. Now, it took minutes of focused concentration. "The wind is picking up," Hermione said, entering the room with a stack of old parchments. She paused, watching him. Draco didn't look up. "I noticed. The window in the kitchen rattled 3 times in the last hour. If I had my magic, I would have sealed it in a heartbeat." The seesaw began its slow, familiar tilt, warmth toward frustration. "I can fix it, Draco," she said softly, reaching for the wand she kept tucked in her waistband. "No." His voice was sharp, a jagged edge of the old Malfoy pride. He finally looked at her, and the slate grey of his eyes was clouded with a bitter, simmering resentment. "I don't want you to fix it. I don't want to be reminded every 5 minutes that I am a guest in a world where you are a god." That is unfair, and you know it, Hermione replied, crossing the room. She sat on the rug at his feet, leaning her head against his knee. I am not a god. I am a woman who works in a bookshop and worries about the rain. You are a witch who chooses to work in a bookshop, he countered, dropping the knife onto the table with a clatter. I am a man who has no choice but to be useless. Do you know what it's like? To reach for a part of your soul every morning and find only a void? To feel the world through a thick layer of wool? The non-verbal intimacy of the moment shifted. She felt the tension in his leg, the way his hand hovered near her hair but hesitated to touch it. He felt like a ghost haunting his own skin. I chose this life because I chose you, she whispered, and I would choose it 1,000 times more. Then you're as mad as they say you are, he rasped. But he finally let his hand fall, his fingers tangling in her curls, a touch that was hesitant and full of a desperate, unspoken need. The silence between them was no longer the peaceful quiet of the ministry cell. It was the tense, electric silence of two people who were navigating a map with no landmarks. Hermione reached up, taking his hand and pressing it to her lips. She could feel the calluses forming on his palms, the marks of a man who was learning to work with his hands. The village is talking, she said after a long moment, trying to change the subject. They think we're political refugees from Eastern Europe. Mrs. Higgins from the bakery asked if you were a former count. Draco let out a short, dry laugh. A count? If only she knew. I was a prince of a dying empire, and now I can barely start a fire without matches. He pulled her up until she was sitting beside him on the narrow sofa. The atmosphere in the room changed, the can't stand it, softening into a heavy, sensual pull. The scent of wood smoke and rain clung to his clothes. I saw you today, he whispered, his face hovering close to hers. In the garden. You were casting a charm to dry the laundry. You looked radiant, and for a second, I hated you for it. I hated that you were so beautiful and so powerful, and I was just a shadow watching you. Draco. But then, he continued, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip, you looked at the house. You looked for me, and the look on your face. It wasn't pity. It was hunger. Why, Hermione? Why do you still look at me like I'm the only thing that matters? Because you are, she said, her voice trembling. She leaned in, closing the distance. The kiss was different from the one under the willow tree. It wasn't a seal of victory. It was an anchor in a storm. It was slow, tasting of the apple he had been peeling and the salt air from the window. Draco groaned into her mouth, his hands sliding up to frame her face with an intensity that bordered on pain. He was pouring his frustration, his loss, and his terrifying love into the contact. Without magic, his emotions felt more raw, more concentrated. Hermione felt herself sinking into him, her mind finally quiet for the first time all day. But as the kiss deepened, a sharp, cold draft swept through the room. The front door, which had been locked, creaked open on its hinges. Draco pulled back, his eyes narrowing. Even without his magic, his instincts were honed by years of living in a house of shadows. He stood up, shielding Hermione with his body, his hand instinctively reaching for a wand that wasn't there. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice dropping into that dangerous aristocratic register. The shadows in the hallway shifted. A man stepped into the light of the fire. He was tall, thin and dressed in robes that had once been expensive but were now tattered and stained. His face was a mirror of Draco's, but twisted by madness and the long-term effects of Azkaban. "Hello, Draco," Lucius Malfoy said, his voice a ghost of the past. "You've made a very quiet life for yourself, a very common life." Hermione felt a cold dread wash over her. She stood up, her wand already in her hand, the tip glowing with a fierce protective light. "Lucius," she spat, "you're supposed to be under guard." "The Ministry is a sieve, Miss Granger," Lucius drawled, his eyes raking over her with a disgust that hadn't faded with time. He looked at Draco, his gaze lingering on his son's empty hands. "And my son, my only heir. I heard the rumors, but I didn't believe them. You traded the magic of centuries for her. You gave away the sun for a handful of dirt." "I gave away a cage, father," Draco said, his voice steady despite the visible tremor in his hands. He didn't move away from Hermione. "And I suggest you leave before you find out exactly how much dirt is worth when it's pushed too far." "You have no power here," Lucius sneered, raising his own wand, a dark, gnarled thing that pulsed with a sickly green light. "You are a squib, a disgrace. I didn't come here to kill you, Draco. I came to take back what belongs to the family, the ring, the seal, the last of the Malfoy essence." The seesaw slammed into repulsion and danger. The sanctuary was broken. The world they had tried to build was being invaded by the very sins they had tried to bury. "He doesn't have it," Hermione said, stepping around Draco, her wand pointed directly at Lucius's chest. "The magic is gone. The debt is paid. There is nothing left for you to take." "Oh, there is always something left," Lucius whispered, his eyes flashing with a sudden, violent mania. "The blood still carries the memory. If I cannot have the magic, I will have the blood." He flicked his wand. "Expelliarmus!" Hermione cried, but Lucius was faster. He didn't aim for her. He aimed for the foundations of the house. The ceiling groaned. Dust and plaster rained down. Draco lunged for Hermione, tackling her to the floor as a heavy oak beam collapsed exactly where she had been standing. In the chaos and the smoke, Lucius's laugh echoed, a high-pitched, broken sound that reminded Hermione of Bellatrix. "The sins don't stay buried, Draco," he shouted through the debris. "They follow you. They wait for you in the dark." When the dust settled, the front door was swinging in the wind. Lucius was gone. Hermione lay beneath Draco, her heart hammering against his chest. They were covered in white dust, looking like statues of themselves. Draco was shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, terrifying rage. "He's not finished," Draco whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "He won't stop until he sees us burn." "We'll find him," Hermione said, her fingers clutching his shirt. "Together." Draco pulled back, looking at the wreckage of their living room. He looked at his hands, then at the wand in Hermione's hand. For the first time since the ritual, the "can't help but think" was replaced by a singular, cold resolve. "I don't need magic to kill a monster," he said, his eyes turning to slate. "I just need to remember how he taught me to be one." The cliffhanger wasn't about the fight to come. It was about the dark parts of Draco that were being forced back to the surface. As the wind howled through the broken cottage, Hermione realized that the sins of Pureblood were not just a debt to be paid. They were a ghost that refused to stay in the grave. And this time, the price might not be magic. it might be their peace. The air in the cellar of the broken cauldron was thick with the smell of sour ale, wet wool, and the unmistakable, prickly heat of illegal enchantments. This was the underbelly of the wizarding world, a place where the ministry's light rarely reached, and where a man's history was traded like a currency. Draco stood in the center of the room, his long black coat buttoned to the chin. He looked like a phantom of his former self, leaner, colder, his presence stripped of its magical hum, but sharpened by a desperate human edge. Hermione stayed in the shadows behind him, her hand gripping her wand beneath her cloak. She was the power in the room. But here, in the world of old names and blood debts, Draco was the key. "I told you, Malfoy," a squat man with a glass eye hissed from behind a scarred wooden desk. "The word on the street is you're a blank, a hollow. Why should I tell you anything? You've got no gold and no sting." Draco didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk. Without his magic, he couldn't cast a silencing charm, but the sheer weight of his gaze made the room feel smaller. "I have something better than gold, Mundungus," Draco whispered, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "I have the ledger of every vault my father ever touched. I know which lost artifacts are sitting in your back room right now, and I know exactly which auras are looking for them. If you don't tell me where Lucius is hiding, I won't need magic to ruin you. I'll just use the truth." The seesaw swung with a sharp, jarring force. Authority versus vulnerability. Mundungus Fletcher paled, his glass eyes spinning erratically. He looked at Hermione, then back at the man who used to be the crown prince of Slytherin. "He's at the Blackwood Manor, the old summer house. But he isn't alone, Draco. He's gathered the stragglers, the ones who still think the Dark Mark is a medal." Draco straightened his spine. "Thank you for your honesty, Fletcher. I'd suggest you move your inventory before tomorrow morning." As they stepped out into the damp, narrow alleyway of Diagon Alley's side streets, the silence between them was taut. The rain was a fine mist, clinging to Hermione's hair like diamonds. She watched Draco, her heart aching with a mixture of pride and terror. He was using the only weapons he had left, his name and his cunning. But she could see the cost in the way his jaw was set. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice soft against the rain. "I am the only one who can get past the wards," Draco replied, not looking at her. "The house recognizes the blood, even if the magic is gone. If you try to blast your way in, he'll kill you before you reach the foyer. And what happens when you get inside? You're defenseless, Draco." He stopped and turned to her. The "can't help but think" flared in his eyes, the raw, pulsing fear for her safety that had become his compass. He reached out, his fingers grazing the damp fabric of her hood. "I have you," he said. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. He wasn't looking for a savior, he was looking for a partner. "I'll drop the wards from the inside. You'll have 30 seconds to breach the perimeter. It has to be perfect, Hermione." "I never fail an assignment, Malfoy," she whispered, echoing the words she had said to him in the ministry cell a lifetime ago. The seesaw tipped toward trust. They moved through the darkness toward the outskirts of the city, where the Blackwood Manor sat like a rotting tooth in the middle of a dead forest. The air here felt different, thick with the same cloying, sickly sweet decay that had plagued the villa in France. When they reached the edge of the property, Draco paused. He looked at the looming silhouette of the house, his face a mask of iron. He took Hermione's hand, his thumb tracing the pulse in her wrist. "If this goes wrong," he began. "It won't." "If it does," he insisted, pulling her closer until their chests touched. "Go. Don't look back. Don't try to be a hero for a man who is already a ghost. Promise me." "I promise to do what is necessary," she said, her eyes burning with a fierce Gryffindor fire. She leaned up and kissed him, a hard, desperate contact that tasted of rain and iron. It was a goodbye, and a battle cry rolled into one. Draco held her for a second longer than necessary, his hands memorizing the curve of her waist before he turned and walked into the shadows of the wards. Hermione watched him go, her heart a drum in her ears. She counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Inside the house, the air was freezing. Draco walked through the foyer, his footsteps echoing on the cracked marble. The portraits on the walls hissed as he passed, their painted eyes full of malice. He reached the central wardstone, a jagged obsidian pillar in the heart of the drawing room. "So," a voice drawled from the balcony above, "the prodigal son returns." Without his wand, but with his pride intact. Lucius Malfoy stepped into the light. He looked worse than he had at the cottage. His eyes were sunken, his hands shaking with the effort of holding together his fractured mind. Behind him, 3 men in dark robes emerged from the shadows, their wands pointed at Draco's heart. "Drop the wards, Father," Draco said, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "This is between you and me. Let her go." "She is the reason you are broken," Lucius screamed, his voice cracking. "She is the rot in the fruit. I will kill her, and then I will find a way to bleed the magic back into you, even if I have to drain every drop of your common life to do it." Draco didn't wait. He didn't have a wand, but he had the one thing Lucius had forgotten, the blood right of the firstborn. He slammed his hand onto the obsidian pillar, his palms slicing open on a jagged edge. "By the blood of the heir," Draco roared, his voice shaking the foundations of the house. "I dissolve the protection. I open the gates." The house let out a literal shriek. The black wards shattered like glass, the magical feedback sending a shockwave through the room. Lucius was thrown back against the balcony railing. In that instant, the front door exploded inward. Hermione was a whirlwind of light. She didn't use stunners. She used the raw kinetic energy of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The 3 Death Eaters were incapacitated before they could even utter a curse. She stood in the center of the room, her hair wild, her eyes glowing with the violet light of the ritual they had shared. She looked at Lucius, her wand steady. "Get away from him," she commanded. Lucius scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He raised his wand toward Hermione, his lips curling into the killing curse. "Avada!" "No!" Draco lunged. He didn't have magic, but he had the weight of his body and the momentum of a decade of suppressed rage. He tackled his father over the balcony railing. They fell together, crashing onto the marble floor of the foyer. Hermione screamed, sprinting down the stairs. "Draco!" She found them in a heap. Lucius was unconscious, his wand snapped beneath him. Draco was gasping for air, his face covered in blood, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the broken man beside him, and for the first time, there was no fear. There was only a profound, weary pity. "It's over," Draco whispered, as Hermione dropped to her knees beside him. The seesaw swung toward warmth and exhaustion. She pulled him into her lap, her hands shaking as she checked him for injuries. He was bruised, his ribs were likely broken, but he was alive. "You're a madman," she sobbed, clutching him to her chest. "You absolute arrogant madman." "I told you," he rasped, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "I'm quite good at the hard way." The Auras arrived minutes later, led by a grim-faced Kingsley. As they dragged Lucius away in chains, the old house seemed to exhale, the dark magic dissipating into the night air. Kingsley looked at the two of them, the disgraced unspeakable and the wandless heir, sitting on the floor of a ruined dynasty. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that the debt was truly, finally paid. As they walked out of the Blackwood Manor, the sun was beginning to rise over the dead forest. The light was pale and watery, but it was light nonetheless. Draco stopped at the edge of the woods, looking back at the house. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, his chest didn't feel tight. The sins of pure blood had been dragged into the light and defeated, not by magic, but by a choice. He turned to Hermione. The tension between them was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet peace. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "What now?" he asked. "Now," Hermione said, leaning her head on his shoulder as they walked toward the road. "We go home. We fix the kitchen window, and we start the next chapter." Draco squeezed her hand. "I think I'd like that, as long as you're the one holding the pen." The dawn broke over the horizon, and for the first time, the silence wasn't a void. It was a promise. A year had passed since the dust had settled in the ruins of Blackwood Manor. In the wizarding world, a year was often enough time for the public to find a new scandal, a new hero, or a new villain. But for Draco and Hermione, time had slowed down, moving with the rhythmic pace of the tides outside their cottage. They had stayed in the village, though the cottage was no longer a place of hiding. It was a home. The kitchen window had been fixed. Draco had done it himself, with a hammer, some putty, and a patience that would have baffled his younger self. It was a late autumn evening, and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and sea salt. Hermione sat at the small wooden table, a mountain of research papers spread before her. She was no longer an unspeakable, but she was still Hermione Granger. She had become a consultant for the Gringotts Cursebreakers, working from home to dismantle the very type of blood magic that had nearly destroyed them. Draco entered from the garden, his cheeks flushed from the wind. He was carrying a basket of late-harvest apples. He moved with a new kind of grace, not the ethereal, floaty movements of a wizard, but the grounded, sturdy presence of a man who knew the weight of the earth. "You're overworking again," he said, placing the basket on the counter. He walked over to her, his hands, now rougher, stronger, resting on her shoulders. The seesaw had finally found its equilibrium, trust and tenderness. Hermione leaned her head back against his chest, closing her eyes. "This scroll is from the 14th century, Draco. The arithmancy is fascinating. It suggests that intent matters more than the incantation." "I could have told you that," he murmured, his thumbs tracing small circles at the base of her neck. The non-verbal intimacy between them had become their primary language. In the year of silence, the magical silence in Draco's head, They had learned to speak through the way they shared space. A look across the room, a hand resting on a lower back, the way he knew exactly how she liked her tea without her asking. "The Ministry sent another owl today," she said, her voice dropping. Draco stiffened slightly, but he didn't pull away. "And?" "They've offered to review your case early. Kingsley thinks that with the evidence of your help in capturing the remaining stragglers, they might return your wand. Not in 9 years. Now." The silence that followed was heavy. A year ago, this would have been the only thing Draco wanted. To be whole again. To have the power that was his birthright. He walked around the table and sat opposite her. He looked at his hands, then at her. The "can't help but think" was there, but it was no longer fueled by fear. It was fueled by a profound, quiet wisdom. "I don't want it," he said. Hermione blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "Draco, you'd be a wizard again. You could travel. You could help me with these wards. You could—" "I am a man, Hermione," he interrupted, his voice steady. "For 20 years, I defined myself by what I could do with a stick of hawthorn. I defined myself by a bloodline that hated me as much as it hated you. This past year, I've been more alive than I ever was at the manor." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. The contact was electric, just as it had always been, but the charge was different now. It wasn't the spark of a curse. It was the warmth of a bond that didn't need a ritual to exist. "If I take that wand back," he continued, "I go back to being a Malfoy. I go back to the world that expects me to be something I'm not. Here. With you, I'm just Draco. I like being just Draco." The seesaw tipped toward vulnerability. Hermione felt a lump in her throat. She had spent so long worrying that he would resent her for his loss, but she realized now that he saw it as a gift. "You're sure?" she whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. He stood up, pulling her to her feet. "Except for one thing." He led her toward the back door, out onto the small wooden porch that looked over the cliffs. The moon was a sliver of silver in the sky, reflecting off the dark, churning water of the Atlantic. The wind was cold, but when he wrapped his arms around her from behind, she felt perfectly warm. "I used to think that pure blood was a shield," Draco said into her hair, "that it made me untouchable. But it was actually a wall. It kept the world out. It kept you out." He turned her around to face him. In the moonlight, his eyes were the color of the sea. There were no masks left, no arrogance, just a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side. "I don't need magic to love you, Hermione. I don't need a wand to protect you. I just need to be here." The tension broke, dissolving into a deep, soul-shattering intimacy. Hermione reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You've always been enough," she said. "Even in that cell, when you were trying so hard to be cruel, I knew." "You always knew everything," he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over hers. The kiss was slow, lingering, and full of the "can't stand it" that had finally turned into a "can't live without." It was a promise of a future that didn't involve ancient debts or family sins. It was the taste of a new world. As they stood there, held together by nothing but their own choice, a soft white light began to glow from the garden. Hermione pulled back, her eyes widening. "Draco, look." In the center of the garden, where they had planted white lilies a few months ago, The flowers were blooming, but they weren't just blooming. They were glowing with a soft internal radiance. It wasn't the jagged violet light of the Malfoy curse. It was a pale, gentle gold. "Is that—" Draco started. "Spontaneous magic," Hermione whispered, her voice full of awe. "The earth is reacting to the intent. You're not a squib, Draco. Your magic didn't die. It just changed. It's no longer in your blood. It's in your heart." Draco looked at the flowers, then back at his hands. He reached out toward a nearby rosebush that had been struggling in the salt air. He didn't use a wand. He didn't use an incantation. He just touched a withered leaf with a feeling of pure, unadulterated hope. The leaf turned green. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He wasn't the powerful sorcerer he had once been, and he would never be a pureblood heir again. But he was something better. He was a part of the world, not its master. He looked at Hermione, his eyes shimmering with tears. I think I can live with this kind of magic." "I think we both can," she said, laughing through her own tears. She threw her arms around his neck, and he swung her around, their laughter echoing over the sound of the waves. The sins of pure blood were finally, truly washed away. There was no more debt. There was no more cold. They walked back into the cottage, the door closing behind them, leaving the glowing garden to light the night. The story of the Malfoys and the Grangers had been a tragedy for 1,000 years. But as the lights in the cottage went out, and the two of them found each other in the dark, a new story was beginning. It was a story about a girl who saw a soul worth saving, and a boy who was brave enough to let her. And in the end, that was the only magic that ever really mattered.
Thank you for listening to this story. Writing about Draco and Hermione is always a journey. To me, this story is not just about magic, it is about how we change. It is about how we let go the past to find the future. Draco had to lose everything to find himself. Hermione had to break the rules to save a soul. They remind us that no one is ever truly lost. Even after a war, love can grow in the cracks of a broken heart. I hope you felt the tension. I hope you felt the rain and the silence of the ministry. Most of all, I hope you enjoyed the slow change from enemies to something much deeper. Love is the strongest magic. It does not care about blood or names. It only cares about the person standing in the front of you. Thank you for being here with me. Until the next story. Goodbye.